Hello my friends, Sakuya here, and welcome back to another alternate history Hearts of Iron 4 video. If I look weird, I apologize. This is definitely a different setup than what I'm used to. After a lot of life events, I'm going to be preparing to move into a new house, but that's not set to happen for like a month or so yet. So temporarily, I'm staying in an apartment, and I don't have basically anything in the way of setup. You want to see how my mic is held up right now? I am sitting here on the floor. My microphone is attached to a boom arm that is connected to a potted plant. That is my life. Well, either way, you all know how it is that we do things on this channel. We take the top 4 most liked comments that gave suggestions for alternate history scenarios, we put that into a poll, and we let you all vote on it. In this case, the majority of you wanted to see, what if Italy had joined the Central Powers in World War I like they should have? And that in and of itself is a very interesting question because by itself, it's not technically true. See, this is a premise that has been put out in many different cases when talking about alternate history settings. And like, oh, well, what if the Italians had honored the Triple Alliance and joined with the Germans and the Austrians? Like, what if they had done this? Well, the reality is that the Triple Alliance itself was something that was more of a defensive alliance than anything else. And there were years of events that ended up turning the Italians against the Austrians and the Germans in the first place. So in order for that to change, a lot needs to happen before the events of 1914. Italy in the first place, as I'm sure that many people are familiar with the jokes about World War II. It's not exactly a strong place to say the least. It's there are a lot of problems, which is kind of exemplified in the history that it talks about right here for the brief. Italy is the smallest third of the Triple Alliance, an alliance with which she has little faith in. In Austria-Hungary, Italy's natural rival is now a friend of the world of treaties, but still a rival in practical terms. After all, Italian Irredentism still decrees that Austrian-held Dalmatian coast as Italian. For now, however, there are more pressing matters. War plans with the Ottoman Turks are already being drawn up. The government predicts a short, decisive war. Italy shall prove her power. This is one of the big things. Italy was the new player on the block, arguably. Like, you had first the Germans that went and unified, then you had the Italians that went and unified. But in comparison to the power of the German Empire after it came into existence in 1871, Italy was, we're not even going to say second fiddle to the rest. Like, no, Italy was just in a horrible position pretty much all the time and was a great power only on paper. Its economy was completely and utterly backwards. It was so poorly industrialized. It was experiencing all these different problems and crises within its political system, its national identity, so much more that just really hurt it. In fact, one of the key things that ended up driving the Italians toward joining the Entente in order to attack the Central Powers is specifically that the Italian politicians wanted to be able to unite the populace behind them in one cause for what they saw as potentially an easy victory that would gain them the territories that they wanted here along the coast, and simultaneously from that, they would be able to strengthen themselves. Of course, we know how the war actually turned out in the end. The Italians ended up not being as good in the conflict as they had hoped, though they still did make some gains, and from that, they were able to get something after the war, but not as much as they were promised, and not nearly as much as they had hoped. As a result, the Italians were deeply embittered after World War I, which led to the rise of Mussolini and the fascists, and from there, the stage is kind of set for World War II. But what if that didn't happen? What if the Italians had, for whatever reason, honored the Triple Alliance? What if they had, instead of it being a defensive alliance, actually signed up with the Central Powers and done something? Well, as I said, a lot needs to happen prior to 1914. Hell, even when we talk about this, a lot needs to happen prior to 1910 when this mod really begins. First off, it's going to sound cheap, but we are going to need to strengthen Italy from the very get-go. The reality is that Germany and Austria were definitely the dominant powers within the Triple Alliance. Absolutely. The Italians, with their backwards industry, was just nowhere even close to either of them. And Austria was definitely second fiddle to Germany. Absolutely. Really, the contentions over the territory that you would see here, like in the case of Istria, Dalmatia, like all this other territory, Southern Tyrol and more, this is where there is a major problem. Something that for Italian nationalists, they cannot stand the idea that this is something that is going to remain in Austrian hands. However, Austria is going to really see no need historically to give this up, because why would they? They were great, they were powerful, they were strong, they were one of the old greats, and Italy, though useful, we will say, was not necessarily a major threat to them. In order for that to change, that means that Italy theoretically would have had to have greater industry. It would have had to have greater capabilities. Not necessarily much, but if we can argue perhaps a 10 or 20% increase, that in and of itself is pretty significant. As a result, instant construction, we're just going to give Italy 3 more civilian factories and 2 more military factories. It is not much, it really is not, but it is something that is going to help in the long term. Will Italy still be the smallest of the powers? Yes, it absolutely will. It will still be much smaller than Austria here, but that is something that is going to aid it. Simultaneously, on the focus tree, Italy has a fairly concise focus tree. The reality is that we need to make sure that some of this has already happened. Italy was definitely backwards in comparison to the rest of Europe regarding industrialization, but theoretically, if things had gone a little bit different in previous decades, if politically things were a little bit more sound, and if perhaps the Germans and the Austrians had invested more resources in Italy to bind the economies closer together, then this is something that we theoretically would have seen greater strengths. We're not going to do everything, mind you, but we will say that Italy has already completed early industrialization. The Industrial Revolution has been very slow to hit Italy, and with a conflict brewing, it is vital that we rectify this. By funding industrial expansion around Italy, we can accelerate industrialization and, by extension, build more guns. We will say that that is done. The next step on here would be continue Messina reconstruction, which that is a fascinating note. Back in 1908, you had the Messina earthquake, which was one of the worst natural disasters to ever hit Europe. Like 80,000 people ended up dying in southern Italy because of this earthquake. It was insane. We can perhaps say that the earthquake was not as severe. Maybe 40,000 people died, which is still horrible, mind you, of course, but the damage was not as widespread or as severe, and simultaneously from that, it means that reconstruction was quicker and Italy was able to get back on its feet faster. From that, we will also complete the Azienda Autonoma, the thing that gives us more railways, and that's pretty much it. We will do these 3 things here now, along with saying that perhaps the Navy was a little bit more developed as well as the military. These 5 focuses, which is a decent amount. That's a year's worth of time, but we will say that these things were at least done already. And that is it. Beyond that, Italy at the beginning of 1910 is still largely going to focus internally and on industrialization. It is going to modernize its railways, it is going to build up its industries, and it's going to try to catch up to the other great powers. We need to further increase the amount of funding put into our railroad system if we are to ever catch up to the other major powers and rectify our pitiful railroad system. From that, research-wise, naturally, of course, things are going to be poured into industry, trying to develop the backward state as much as possible. Construction, so much more is going to be done. And from here, my friends, we can thus begin. The thing that really sucks about Italy is that from the very beginning, they don't really have much in the way of resources at all for anything, which means the minuscule industry that you get has to be traded away. Because we're going to assume that Italy has a slightly larger industry, we're going to say that it has a bit more access to resources, but more importantly, it is going to be able to trade for more and get access to these, and for those trade relationships, we are going to say that it mostly comes from Germany and Austria. Specifically, Germany for the most part, because that is going to be Italy's major backer. From here, you can actually see in the decisions the ideas of Italia Irredenta, which is the big thing that is driving Italy forward at this time, and again, one of the key reasons why they sided with the Allies. The early stages of Italian Irredentism triumphed with Il Risorgimento. Oh dear God, I cannot even pronounce this thing. Risorgimento, back in the 19th century. But beyond that, there are ethnic regions that have not yet been recovered to truly achieve the ideas of Italian unification. These ideas shall be resurfaced, and Italy shall stand tall through the ages. Viva l'Italia! The important thing from the beginning here is that we need the Germans and the Austrians to see the Italians as true allies in the sense, not just something that is a matter of necessity, but an actual valuable partner. At the same time, diplomatically, certain things will need to change. Yes, we're not going to be able to just remove the Italian nationalists or the socialists or all the other groups that were causing a lot of problems and fighting in the street. There is no way that is going to work out, and it would be ridiculous to just assume that, oh, the Italians are fine politically, because they're not. They're absolutely not. But we can assume that their relations with others were better, that they were perhaps more diplomatic in their approach, and that maybe they focused a little bit more inward instead of outward, so that, as an example, the Italians do not go and invade Libya, they do not make an enemy of the Ottomans, they don't do these things like they did in our own time. Why is that important? Well, we will explain here in a second. With the modernization of the railroad system done, the next step after this would be Ansaldo, which, yeah, half these things don't have descriptions in the first place, but essentially, Italy will be modernizing its industry during this time and building up its factories. After Ansaldo, the next step up here is Bretta's locomotives. More of the specialist Italian factories will be developed, and from there we will see fine Italian goods being produced, and perhaps we will then say that these were of even higher quality than they were in our own time, which, yeah, Italy did actually have very highly skilled, specialized workers and factories. The big problem that they ended up running is that they usually weren't able to scale these up to a large degree to actually equip soldiers in a very efficient manner. They had very good gear, just they couldn't produce a lot of it usually very quickly. At the same time that this is going on, major army restructuring is going to have to take place. The Italians and their political, economic, and military system were never exactly strong, but we can assume from this time that greater efforts are specifically put towards modernizing the military and actually bringing it up to speed with the rest of the powers. Will it be to nearly the same degree? No, but we can assume that they perhaps perform slightly better. The more competent officers survive. Things are better in this time. After that, we will go ahead and do Lancia, and then immediately after that, we will have the University of Rome. Like, that is going to be done, and the future has passed here. The Italians, as I said, will be taking this time to specifically modernize themselves. Here we have our first political development, Giolitti IV's cabinet. The balance between right and left parties was kept by Giolitti from 1903 onwards. It was no longer sustainable. New groups entered political life, socialist reformist, Catholic conservatives, and corporatist nationalists. All that combined with the future electoral reform makes it harder and harder for Giolitti to hold his position. Yeah, Italian politics, as I said, is really messy. Really messy indeed. Famine in Sahel. Colonial Africa has been going through a particularly difficult season since the beginning of 1910. Harvests are poor and local populations suffer from malnutrition. If it is left in this precarious state for too long, the inhabitants of these poor regions could revolt. We must do something. Fantastic, yeah. We can assume from this time here that Italy perhaps does not have to waste nearly as many resources because, potentially, the famine is not as bad as it was in our own time. And if anything, the humanitarian effort that is provided is something that actually helps the people and actually binds them closer to Italy. Things are better for them, we will say. From this, then, as Italy develops itself, we can say that perhaps the army was better organized than it was in our own time. That this is something that the reforms that take place happen earlier. While our army is loyal, it lacks the training to achieve much in battle. We should start a nationwide army exercise to get the most out of our men. 1,000 elite soldiers are better than 5,000 conscripts. So here it is then, my friends. We have the first issue that potentially comes to the table. Now, historically, if I recall correctly, with the Agadir crisis over Morocco, the Italians were not involved at all. We can theoretically say from this time that the Italians support the Germans more, we can say. I don't really know what else to really call it. Sultan Yusuf dies. An exiled Sultan, Yusuf Kali Kinaladid, died this August in Eritrea. He was most notable for signing a treaty with which effectively made Sultanate of Hoi4 our protectorate in 1889, but later was sent from the country because he was deemed dangerous. His son, Kali Yusuf Kinadid, formally succeeded him in the title of Sultan. The question now is, should we allow his return to Hoi4? Well, no, we're fine with local running business. That's fine. The Italians, we can say, have a greater degree of control over their colonial efforts, but to the point that they don't necessarily have as much of a desire to expand, which, yes, I understand. Historically, Italy really did want colonies because they wanted to show that they were the big boys now. They really did want to do this, but we can say that the Italian efforts were focused a little bit more internally versus externally. So it is then, my friends, that before 1912 rolls around, we can largely say that Italy was significantly more industrialized than they were in our own time. Normally, this would not have been something that was possible, but in this new time, Italy is on stronger footing. From this greater industrial capability, not only are they producing significantly more equipment for the army, but simultaneously, that means the navy itself is something that is more powerful. Civitavecchi is one of the most important ports in the country. It would be foolish not to expand our industrial capabilities in this region. Does Italy's involvement in the Agadir crisis actually do anything? No. The exact same thing as what happens in our own time is likely to happen. I don't know. So it is, my friends, as 1912 rolls around, that Italy historically would look more to its colonial ambitions. This is where the Turco-Italic War would break out, except in this time, we're not going to be following that path. Here's one of the things you need to understand is that when Italy joined the Entente, one of the key reasons why this happened is because the relations between Italy and the Central Powers were fairly strained because the Austrians and the Germans were actually trying to make friends with the Ottomans, and they didn't really appreciate that Italy had gone to war with the Ottomans over for Libya. As a result, Italy is still going to have colonial ambitions in this time, to be sure, but they're not necessarily going to want to rock the boat with the Ottomans, which, if they have closer diplomatic ties with the Austrians and the Germans in this time, they're probably not going to want to pursue that. Of course, they will still demand control over Somaliland. That is something that is going to happen. Vittorio Emanuele III is attacked. Yes, Victor Emmanuel III gets attacked by an anarchist while attending a funeral that is literally for his father, Umberto I, who was killed 12 years ago by the anarchist Gaston Bresci. The attacker was apprehended and beaten by the crowd. The bullet missed. Yeah, that's a problem Italy is still going to have, as anarchists. As 1911 rolls around into 1912, which rolls around into 1913, really not much is going to change in this time. The big thing is that the Italo-Turkic War doesn't happen. Yeah, the Ottomans are not going to be as embarrassed by Italy in this time. They will still have to deal with the Balkan front from, the Greeks, the Bulgarians, and the Serbs, which, yes, they are still going to lose. That is still going to happen, even after not losing to the Italians down here in Libya. But their rule is still going to be shaken, even if they don't face as many losses. Yes, the powder keg still explodes, and the Turks are going to be absolutely crushed from this. Yep, the Second Balkan War was still going to go down exactly the same way as the first one does. Bulgaria gets absolutely screwed. And again, really, not much else is going to change, except Italy is just not involved in any of it. The situation in northern Epirus. The situation in the Balkans is very difficult for the Ottomans. Serbia and Greece have liberated Albania and occupied the whole of this autonomous territory of the Sublime Porte. We must contain Greek expansionism in the region. The army of Athens has seized northern Epirus, a territory which the Albanians live. We should impose upon them the independence of this liberated region, which... Yes, that is specifically something that the Italians would likely push for, because in this time they are still going to have ambitions upon Greece and the Balkans. And yes, this is going to come in conflict with the Austrians, but for now, we will assume that relations are well enough that they are coordinating with the Austrians to make this happen. So it is, my friends, that 1914 rolls around, and this is where everything changes. There it is, the July crisis. Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated. As Europe begins to mobilize across the entire continent, this is where everything gets really, really spicy, and one needs to understand the Italian mindset at this point. We've talked about this multiple times here now as to why the Italians joined the Entente, but really, this is something that you need to understand about the Italians in history here. At this point in history, they're basically scavengers. No, I'm not exaggerating. The Italians were pretty much going around trying to do whatever it is they could to piggyback off of the actions of the other powers to secure their own place. They were pretty much the hyenas of Europe. Oh my God, that sounds so wrong to say. But it is real. Italy was fully prepared to side with whichever side they thought was going to end up winning the war, specifically in order to be able to get something out of it. That was the entire point. Historically, the Italians thought that the Central Powers were going to win fairly easily, but when that didn't happen, that is what actually made them begin to want to side more with the Entente. Naturally, just as in our own time, Serbia was going to refuse Austrian demands, the war was still going to break out, and everything was going to go to crap. But the Italians are not going to be joining in on the conflict immediately. The whole thing with the Triple Alliance, it is still something where the Italians are going to be neutral. They are not going to be joining anything unless they are offered something that makes it worthwhile. So it is here that we then get really what would be the deciding factor for Italy joining in on the conflict. Austria proposes an agreement. We are ready to comply with the Triple Alliance, but marches and protests give us reason to believe that we must ask for concession if our government wishes to survive this agreement. Austria offered to give us Trentino and Fiume to confirm our alliance, and we are inclined to agree. Austria has made this concession only barely, and we need to snatch the opportunity or else we may not get another chance to get those territories without blood and iron. A conference was held in Tyrol, at which an agreement was reached on the transfer of Trentino and Fiume to our realm. We will never forget this friendly deed if we were to accept. Viva Italia. Here's the thing, although we could immediately join this, and this is something that would realistically happen with the scenario that we have built up, it does not necessarily mean that Italy is going to join the war outright. Italy would likely secretly join the Central Powers, but this is only something that would end up taking place specifically after the Austrians show some victories. Historically, the Austrians ended up getting bogged down there in Serbia, and this is something that was one of the reasons why the Italians looked down upon the Central Powers and saw them as allies that, well, probably weren't going to be good allies. The Germans, at the same time, though they were able to break into Belgium fairly easily, ended up getting stopped in northern France, and from there, that means that perhaps they weren't going to win the conflict. In the event that Austria is able to take its forces off the border with Italy and throw them down into Serbia, perhaps maybe with better leadership as well as some other factors, we can really just change history at this point, maybe they're able to break through and do significantly more damage. Does that mean that the Austrians have an easy time and are able to just waltz into Serbia? No, it absolutely does not. But they're able to perform better than they were in our own time. Although in this new timeline, considering that we built up the industry of Italy, they would be more prepared than they were in our own time, it doesn't necessarily mean that they would be prepared to immediately enter the war. In fact, this is something where they likely would still wait until around the same time they did in our own, May or maybe April, or if earlier, March of 1915. Even with a more competent Austria, even with Serbia being crushed, it does not necessarily mean that the Germans would fare better in France. Yes, perhaps additional Austrian reinforcements would be able to come in, which would help with their initial attacks into France itself, but they would eventually be stalled just as they were in our own time. Still, gains were going to be made, and by Christmas of 1914, Serbia would collapse, months, many months before it did in our own time. With no forces having to be sent to the Italian border, instead Austria would be able to dedicate all of its resources towards the north against Russia, which it would have significantly more men in this time because there would have been far less casualties. The fall of Serbia so quickly in that sense would be a huge blow to Entente morale. So it is, my friends, that as the Brusilov offensive would collapse in the east and the Austrians and Germans began to make ground, the Italians would really see which way the winds were turning, and the secret alliance that granted them territory with Austria would go into effect. Italy would join the war. This would be massive, as considering Italy's new time that we have built, this is not like what would have happened realistically in our own time if Italy had joined the conflict as they were, because they were far more backwards, they didn't have as large of a navy, they didn't have as much developments in pretty much any way, especially after having wasted so many other colonial efforts. So it is then that the war in the Alps truly begins. Now, the thing is, this is not something that would necessarily go cleanly. We would think, oh yes, the Italians, surely they're so experienced in the mountains, they surely would be able to do this. Well, to a degree, yes, they will have some successes, but more importantly than anything, they will not have nearly as much training or experience as the French in this context. As a result, the fighting over the Alps is going to be continuous, it is going to be bloody. But for the Germans, this would be a massive boon, as yes, the French don't necessarily need to dedicate as many men as you might think down to the Alps, considering that with the mountains, you don't need nearly as many men to defend such narrow passes, sure, but that is still going to take a lot of pressure off the front for the Germans, and from there they will be able to launch more attacks into France. At the same time, in this new timeline, because of the success that the Austrians would have seen against Serbia early on, they gradually begin to break into Russia at a much more rapid pace. It is around the time that the Italians join in, we can argue maybe even at the exact same time, that the Ottomans too join the Central Powers, and this is a really big deal, with the Italians not having ostracized themselves by dealing a blow to the Ottomans in the first place. It means that the Ottomans are actually in a healthier, stronger position. In light of the war, Italy would move to form a liberal union to try and stabilize its political situation. And the Entente at this point would truly be hurting. It's not like we can say in this time that because Italy joins, oh, the Ottomans are not going to join, then they're going to instead side with the Allies or the Entente. No, that's not the case. In fact, the big thing is now that their attention is going to be so much more heavily split, the French and the British are not going to be able to reinforce nearly as many positions or be able to engage the Ottomans in the same way that they did in our own time. And the Ottomans fought a truly impressive battle even against the odds that they did. Unable to hold an unstable coalition between conservatives and radicals, Giolotti was forced to resign, and under the pressure of the radicals who threatened to exit, he resigned. Antonio Salandra, a conservative, was chosen by him to form a new government. Yes, things are naturally quite unstable, but importantly, claims on France are able to be hashed out with the Germans. Oh dear God, that is a massive naval battle. Yeah, here is the thing that is likely to happen. In this time in which Italy has actually developed its navy more, it didn't really have a big navy, especially in comparison to the other powers. France and Britain by far had the biggest, along with Germany. But with the attention of Britain and France being divided and having to actually contend with German unrestricted submarine warfare, this means that in this new time, the Austrian and Italian navy combined is able to do some serious damage in the Mediterranean, keeping things highly contested. Battle after battle after battle would rage over the Alps, and really at this point, not much is likely to move. But potentially, through sheer force and after diverting enough attention away, the Germans are able to make some gains in the north, allowing the Italians to make their own further gains into the south. And with additional forces that were able to come in from the Austrians, and with greater success that they would see here without having to defend the Italian border, it means that, well, the Russians are going to be in for a worse time, potentially collapsing much earlier than they did in our own time. So it is a full year ahead of schedule that Russia would begin to collapse. From this, we would eventually see the Soviet Union arise, a peace deal made, and German reinforcements would flood into the Western Front. Except this time, in comparison to having to deal with the Italians in the south against the Austrians, now the French have even thinner numbers. Whoa, wait. Calculating peace. Hold on. What was going on with this? Oh, there it goes, the Bolshevik coup. Alright, finally. In July of 1916, I was not expecting to go that early. Yes, in this time, considering that mass German reinforcements are able to then flood into the east or into the west, and considering that the Austrians will no longer have to deal with the Italians, because again, that's the new timeline that we built, this means that all of those forces will then be able to flood over to the varying different fronts. From this, major pushes into the Alps, despite horrendous casualties this most certainly will cause, major pushes are able to be made. By Christmas of 1917, things are going to continually get harsher and harsher and harsher. Despite the successes on the Eastern Front, the Austrians and the Germans would begin to feel great pains from lacks of resources. The farming and famine and epidemic that would follow would only create more pain and suffering. But with Italian and Austrian forces breaking in through the south, France, at this point, would likely be done for. It would become a matter of who could hold out the longest. With the Germans right outside the gates of Paris itself and the Italians moving through the south, it would make sense that the capital would likely be moved away, or at least the administrative capital for controlling the war effort from Paris. Though, in this case, having moved down to Bordeaux, that's not going to end well. By the spring of 1917, the administrative capital of France falls. Before long, the Entente would not be able to continuously keep up the fight. Please fall, please. Oh my god, thank god, finally. In the end, by late spring, summer of 1917, with the scenario that we have built, the Entente falls. With the fall of Paris, and the millions that now lie dead across the battlefield, the Central Powers reign supreme. A new order is carved within Europe, as at this point there is not many smaller powers, but instead 4 massive empires that now take the reins. Which, among these, considering the losses, Italy is likely to experience severe internal crisis, as well as Austria, and even the Ottomans will likely also experience this as well. From this, the only one that is likely to survive holding itself together within the next decade is going to be the Germans. With the establishment then of the Frankfurt Peace Conference, peace is determined. But do the Italians get what they want? Well, we have the Copenhagen Convention, and yet despite all the promises that have been made, I guess this is just a feature of the mod, Italy once again goes through the exact same thing that they did in our own timeline, where the promises that were made were not given. We have been betrayed. Italian blood has spilled to win the Great War for the Central Powers, and for what? We were given nowhere near what we were promised, and the people are unhappy. The Germans and the Austrians stabbed us in the back, and so we will take our rightful land one way or another. Yeah, in this new timeline, it doesn't really make sense that Italy, having performed significantly better likely than they would in of our own time, that they would have been given less. It doesn't really make all that much sense. Italy would have still likely been given Savoy, Provence, the Alps region, Corsica. Italy would have been given the greater territory of the Alps to control. They likely also would have been given Tunis, they would have been given Morocco, they would have been given the French varying different colonies there in northern Africa, which would have finally given Italy its colonial ambitions that it always desired. From this, my friends, so ends today's episode. Oh dear God, I've been doing this for way too. It's like 3 a.m. at this point here. I need to go to bed. I appreciate all of you for watching, though. I do love this mod. I love the World War One mod because it's so much fun to play, and yet simultaneously it's so incredibly restrictive, which is very frustrating because even in a scenario in which we've actually done remarkably well, there's not really much I can do afterwards because the victories in that sense are hard-coded and restricted. So that's a frustrating thing. However, in the end, Italy would still likely face a lot of internal issues, even after a victory where they join the Central Powers. After all, one of the key allies they would have, Austria-Hungary, would collapse, and at the same time, this doesn't really address the question of what is going on with Dalmatia. Likely, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Austrian state as it breaks apart and tries to federalize, but largely fails, this means that the Italians would end up still sweeping in on their former ally and taking the coast of Dalmatia, with something that, considering the developments that we would see later, would likely lead to only further conflicts and another war. But either way, that is the end of things here today. Thank you very much for watching, my friends. I appreciate all of you. I will see you all here next time. I gotta go get some rest. Goodbye, everyone.